Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast, your weekly look inside the world of fly fishing presented by Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening, please consider subscribing.
One of the cool things about doing this podcast is that I get the chance to talk to people I look up to who have helped shape me in how I look at fly fishing. My guest today is one of them, Bob Wyatt. His two books, Trout Hunting and What Trout Want, took a good, in-depth and common sense approach to the pursuit of our quarry that I took so much from. I hope to learn some more about Bob, fishing and how he looks at casting a fly to rising trout too. Bob, it's great to have you here today. Thank you so much for chatting with me on the Fly Culture Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Pete. How are you?
Very well indeed, thank you. I'm about to go and chase some grayling in the next couple of days, so I'm looking forward to that very much. But one of the things I've been thinking about, and it's that time of year where it's just, I guess we are a little bit reflective about things and our season that has just passed, and I guess we start thinking about the next one as well. But when it comes to your season, and I know you're based back up in Scotland again, we're going to look at your timeline as well as the books a little bit later. But how would you grade your season? How do you think that's been on a 0 to 10? How would you grade that?
Oh, this hasn't been a very good season for me. The last 2 years, actually, because COVID obviously put a dampener on the year ago. Although we had some trips planned, various policies came into the government as they were feeling their way through this thing. And I've been, I'm one of the old guys now. I've been 76 in February, and so talk about reflecting on seasons. I'm definitely reflecting on seasons. I'm counting them. Maybe two hands if I'm lucky. I've got left. So they're very precious to me now. And this one, I got out. I had a good trip with my friend Bob Morton in the spring up on the Deveron. And we caught some fish. We had some nasty weather. We're going to try and get up there a little bit, just a couple of weeks later this year. It's getting pretty dodgy just if you're planning a week-long trip in the spring, as you know, hitting it right weather-wise. You got to somehow get it between the floods and the snowstorms and things like that. But so, yeah, it wasn't much of a trout season for me. But next one's going to be good. I can feel it.
We're always the eternal optimists, aren't we, as fly anglers?
That's what fishing's all about, Pete.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I wanted to talk about, I guess, our listeners will probably recognise that your accent isn't Scottish. You're from Alberta, and then you went to Scotland, then to New Zealand, and back to Scotland again. They're pretty good fishing hotspots. Is that a lucky coincidence?
No, that's not a coincidence. So, no, this is all carefully thought out. Don't know how well it's been executed, but it's always been a consideration for me. I mean, just where I live is important, and I was lucky enough to grow up and start out, as a kid in southwestern Alberta, which was a fantastic place to do it. At the time I was doing it, I mean, it still is. It's so good. There's nothing like what it was when I was a kid. And it was really, that was the Wild West back then. Very few fishermen around at all. I mean, we'd go for a week or 2 weeks and never meet another trout angler, if you can imagine that. So it was a great place to grow up with. I had a dad and uncles who were all fly fishermen. So these dads started us off pretty young. I mean, I got a fly rod when I was 11 years old. Not that we were really and truly fly fishing, so we'd stick a worm on or a maggot or something. But we learned how to fish the water there through that. And we got out a lot. I mean, from early in the season, from ice out right till freeze up again. And these were meaningful terms in Alberta. We fished just about every weekend, and we'd have holidays, Dad's holidays, get us out. We camped the whole 2 weeks on the Crow's Nest or the Old Man Rivers there, and they were just fantastic places to be. And we had them all oddly. I mean, I can't believe it. Actually, we just had it to ourselves. Had the whole watershed to ourselves, basically, for weeks. So that situation has certainly changed. It has changed fly fishing as well, of course, because now, you're going to meet people, you're going to be fishing around people all the time. It's changed the experience quite a bit. Luckily, there's some great places to fish still. They're being reduced, but not by fishing. They're being reduced by farming and various other things. This is a real concern. I don't know what we're going to do about that, but we still got some places to go. Scotland's good. Scotland's got some great trout streams up here yet. Wild trout up here, and excellent country. It's a fantastic place, and we'll see how next season goes. I get my pal Bob Morton wound up, and he's ready to go all the time. He fishes all the time, no matter what. But so he's who I fish with here.
Nice.
In Scotland, anyway.
Nice. And how was that? There's a couple of questions I'm thinking about there as you say that. When you go back and visit Alberta, do you sort of think, wow, this is completely different to what I was experiencing as a youngster? And then how would you compare the fishing in Alberta to the fishing that you do when you're in Scotland as well? Was that a big adjustment to that sort of fishing as well?
Well, no, it's interestingly, the fishing in southwestern Alberta now, in some respects, is actually better than it was when I was a kid. Because there's been catch and release now for a couple of decades. People, not everybody still puts fish back, but the fishing in these streams they do. The Old Man and the Crow's Nest, for instance, there are a few other rivers down there too. They're excellent trout fishing still, which is amazing because when I was a kid in Calgary, my dad's family were down in the Crow's Nest Pass. They're sort of a mountain family, and that's why we went down there to fish. But when I was a kid in Calgary, it was like 125,000 people in it, right? Which is just a very small city. And everybody just called it a cow town. It was a cow town. It was about agriculture. There's a few oil wells out there in the country, and that was it. It was a farming, ranching country. And that's what made it great. But now I see there's over 1 million in Calgary. And some days you swear everybody's got a fly rod now, because it's a very cool thing to be doing. So of course they are. But these rivers, the Old Man, the Crow's Nest, are still good trout fishing rivers. Now, Crow's Nest, for instance, has been sort of suburbanized quite a bit. A lot of private property on it now, and restrictions about getting into it, and a lot of pressure. But, you just got to handle those trout. As long as you treat them well, you still get very good fishing and pretty good fly hatches still. The Old Man, because it's still ranch country up there, it hasn't been changed very much at all. Access is a bit more difficult in some respects. They don't allow camping on it anymore, things like that, which we did. But the river is still a beautiful river, still got full of trout. My brother's down there, fishes it every weekend, and he's still finding it. Maybe not quite what it was back in the 50s and 60s, because that's a long time ago now. That's a long time ago. But it's still pretty good fishing. Now, Scotland's similar in that respect. I mean, most of the places, I think largely you have to say, it's because of private ownership of the land. Now, I'm not a big, proponent of private ownership I'd like to see more public land here. But, it's the what do they call it? It's the common lands in Canada are receiving a lot of pressure because everybody can use them. You see, and that's a good thing. I think I'm a real, egalitarian that way. But in Scotland here, because everything's private, once you get out into the countryside, these estates or farmland at the very least, it's not so much the old ways where it was, vast estates reserved for deer stalking. It's not quite like that anymore, although it still exists. The salmon streams on the East Coast are all privately owned. That's very valuable real estate, really, property. That's the way they look at it. And so that's expensive to get onto and fish, but there's some very good trout fishing on some of these streams. And it's getting easier access. They used to keep trout fishermen off because they were considered a pest. But now it's getting better. There's more and more associations have access to the water, so you can get some extremely good trout fishing on streams that are fairly close to urban areas, and I can't say that so much for North America anymore. If you're close to cities, these places get pounded, right? But not in Scotland. So you could go up, say on you were mentioning earlier, the Devon, which is a very good trout stream. And you can book a few days on there. It's not going to break the bank, and you get some excellent fishing and some really nice trout, which is remarkable actually. Because I mean, these waters have been fished for centuries here. They're still in good shape. They're still in remarkably good shape. Quite a few of them. So I won't give you away all my spots. But
Exactly right as well.
This is going out. Yeah.
You're okay, Bob. No one's listening anyway.
No. Okay. Good. We keep it between you and me.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. So Scotland, you've adopted Scotland as somewhere to work, to live. And then how did New Zealand come on the radar? Because I was going to ask you, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was there a moment when you realised that fishing to you was more of a pastime? And, it seems as though very early on that was the case. And then, of course, from Alberta to Scotland and then down to New Zealand, and how you've said that fishing and where you're living has something to do with that. And there's somebody who's done something similar. You do think these things deeply through. But I guess it was at a very early age that you realised that fishing meant so much to you and shaped a great deal of your life and how you lived it.
Well, fishing is. I think it's been the one constant in my life. It's been the thing I can hang my hat on. Some people have religion or their work or something like that, but with me, seriously, it's been fishing, and it has seriously. It's been fishing, and it has seriously. It's been fishing, and it has on my screen, so I can't see it. But anyway, yeah. So I mean, I was a fanatic when I was young. So I mean, I was a fanatic when I was young. I mean, I really did. I just thought fish all the time. And when I was a kid, there were a couple of big magazines, North American magazines. When I was a kid, there were a couple of big magazines, North American magazines, were filled as more of a southern bass fishing oriented magazine, but Field and Stream and Outdoor Life were trout fishing magazines, really. And they had in those days, photography was obviously important, but not as important as it is now. They had illustrators, and these illustrators are very good. There's like Bob Kuhn and what's the other guy? I don't remember him in a minute. They would paint pictures of fish, and the magazines would feature these full page illustrations of fish, usually leaping with a fly in their mouth or something like that. And the covers were always illustrated covers. They were never photographic. Sometimes they were photographic, but photography wasn't digital, and it was pretty dodgy to get good fishing photographs, with film. You had to be pretty sharp photographers. So illustrators were amazing. This fascinated me. So I thought, well, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be a wildlife artist, you see. So that's the way I thought about it. But that's where the reading about fishing, and I got to know these great, like AJ McLean and Joe Brooks, and these people, you're familiar with these. Even people here are familiar with those names. And then later, in the 70s, of course, the really big names like Swisher and Richards and other people. But back then, it was all through these outdoor magazines. And so that sort of fueled this obsession somehow, because you felt you were in contact with other people who were just as fanatical as you were. And it's weird in a way, though, because it became more important than anything else, really. Even when I was in high school and was starting to get interested in girls and stuff like that, I was never much of a games, sports and games guy, because all I wanted to do was get out and go fishing. And I met a couple of pals. I had one pal early in high school, and he was a sportsman. He was a hockey player, right? And he he and I used to fish a lot. Like when I was, by the time I was about 17, I guess. That's who I was fishing with. I mean, I really feel bad about this because, it's all boys do. They start making their own friends. They're not going with their dad anymore, their brothers. They've got their own pal, and that's who they go fishing with. And that makes me feel sad, actually. But at the time, of course, it was just Jim and I were just fishing. That's what we were going to do. We're planning and hiking into mountain lakes and fishing all the time. And it never went away. It just got deeper and deeper and deeper. And it's coming to Scotland with my first wife, who was Scottish. That's the first Scottish connection. She came over to do her PhD here, and we stuck. We split up, but through those first few years, we were together. I just got into fishing here, and I met a bunch of fellas here who were Scottish style fanatics in the days when most of them were loch fishermen, and a couple of guys like my pal Bob. They're very traditional, and so I developed a sort of North American approach to trout fishing that was just beginning to merge with the Scottish approach, which was lochs and long rods, and fishing the surface from a drifting boat and hiking into wild browntail lochs. That's what we did. But it's fantastic country for that. And so we'd hike into these hill lochs up in Sutherland and these places, which are still fantastic places. There's still nobody there. There's a few more hikers now than there was. The trout are still there. Another thing I feel a little bit bad about is we killed a lot of fish in those days. We're back now in the middle 80s. And because these boys were of that Scottish tradition, I mean, that's what you did. It was deemed healthy for the loch to kill fish. And that's true, actually, because a lot of these lochs, as you know, are absolutely overpopulated with tiny, wee, struggling fish. But it makes for a lot of action. And we discovered a lot of things with this kind of interplay between the Scottish traditions and my North American approach. We sort of developed our own kind of, this little group of guys developed a way to approach these lochs that really opened our eyes to things. And gradually, not completely, but gradually we got away from the traditional loch style fly tying, getting more towards the North American style. And then within that, I sort of, narrowed my own approach down to this simplified approach that we were talking about earlier, Pete. And so that's how the Scottish component of my life. And so that was about 20 years of that. And I retired from the art school and immediately headed for New Zealand. Because by then I had made a trip. I made the mistake. In 1999, I made my first trip down there. And in some ways, that was probably a mistake because then you realize that's where they were keeping the trout. That is for sure. Back in 1999. It's fabulous. It was paradise for a trout fisherman. And maybe we'll talk about that in a few minutes later, too, because that's changed a lot. But so that kept me going for quite a while. But then I spent a few years up in Northern Australia, too, doing a lot of saltwater fishing. That's how I met Peter Morse. And Pete and I fished quite a bit together, and we know each other quite well. And he's a great guy. There's another total, fishing. He's Mr. Fishing. That's where he lives and breathes. He maybe does a few other things. I think he cooks a bit, but apart from that, I think he's pretty focused. So, but all this, and I met some other guys in New Zealand. These guys they're such serious, committed fishermen. It's such a different game down there. So that was fabulous. Just getting to learn how to fish these places. So that was the New Zealand component, which had a huge effect on me. And now I'm back in Scotland, and I fished for years. I was visiting New Zealand for quite a few years before I moved there. 8 or 9 years I was making 2 trips a year. That's part of the mistake. That's a very expensive thing to do. And but over those years, I modified my approach a lot, and by the time that's when I really started rethinking things. By then, anyway, I was already thinking differently by the late '90s, because I started writing trout hunting. I think back in about, I don't know, maybe 1999. That's when I was writing for fly fishing, fly tying back then. And that's the period when my things were starting to crystallize for me about just how I thought about what trout behavior and how to fish for trout everywhere now, not just in these specific. Because back then, I was getting back then. Now I can talk about it that way. Now we're talking over 20 years ago. We still have these kind of local traditions. They're incredibly strong. They're still strong. I mean, people really and truly believe that their trout want certain kinds of flies and a certain approach. And it's very hard to break. I don't want to break their traditions, but once you start thinking generally about trout behavior and think about what all these other guys have been doing all around the world, approaching the same set of problems, exactly the same set of problems and the same fish in different ways, and they all work. That's what really got me thinking. So how can that be? So, but you don't have to look very far, because the great fishing authors, like the big man in my thinking career for about fishing for trout was Skews. Now he was of his time, of course, but his whole approach to the thing that when he got into his big arguments with Halford over things, was simply because he was out there every day fishing on the same water for the same fish, and realizing gradually he was learning just what was really going on here. He was getting sort of to peel away these layers of tradition and rules and various things and saying, wait a minute, these fish are doing this, and try to do something taken from a different angle, and he did. So he was a huge breakthrough thinker about trout behavior and flies and whatever presentation.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Bob, because you talk about Skews there, and I think a lot of that is chalk stream based and the chance to observe fish. And you say about where you started writing Trout Hunting, that sort of coincides with the start of your obsession, I guess, with the fishing in New Zealand, and that ability to see the fish, to look at their behavior, and to not get many shots at them as well. That must have been an extreme learning curve that I guess your path followed a similar one, isn't it? The observation of trout and the ability to see how they react to a stimulus, be it fear, be it food, be it whatever. That must have been a massive turning point for you to be able to see that behavior of the fish.
Well, no, it absolutely was. And I had help, because we had people realizing things like, say, Hans van Klinken over in wherever he was, Holland, fishing for grayling, and him coming up with that very strange fly, because it's been refined now, but his original Klinkhammer Special was a very odd looking fly by anybody's experience. This is a very and he describes it as very, because he was tying on a great big, I think it was a Yorkshire sedge hook or something like that. Very ugly, big, huge too. When everyone else is thinking grayling in terms of very delicate flies and Sawyer tight nymphs and things like that, and here he was pulling his grayling up to this while there was a hatch going on of various things, usually sedge over there where he was fishing. And that really got to me. What is going on there? So that really got me thinking. So that's why. Then I was looking at Comparadon and various American flies that were really coming to the fore about the same time, just a bit earlier, mind you. And the old Fran Betters. No, very few people talk about Fran Betters. Here's this curmudgeon living out in, I don't know where he was, the Ozarks or something. And I can't remember. It was in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure. But he was a guide, and he had a couple of flies, and one of them was his go-to fly was called the usual, and he had another one called the haystack. Now these flies all influenced my fly tying. Right, it all came together about the same time, because once you start looking for things from a certain perspective, you start seeing the links, and you start seeing the avenues, and you realize there's other people working with the same things, and they go way back. It goes a long way back. This approach, W.C. Stewart on the Scottish streams, fishing his little, spiders, and that was absolutely onto the same thing. And he was a commercial fisherman, basically. He meant to go out and catch a lot of trout, and he wasn't going to waste any time doing it. So now that's not the approach we take to fly fishing, of course. We're not trying to catch as many trout as we can, to sell them or something to make a living. But this stuff informs your approach to things. And I found out, of course, there's lots of people thinking along these lines and trying things that are really quite radical, really, when you think of it, because it's so hard to do something, to step outside of a traditional way of thinking about things, especially fishing. Well, for one thing, you're frightened to, because you don't want to get it wrong, because you can waste a whole day if you think you've got your fly wrong or something like that. But what New Zealand taught me was that's very seldom the case. What goes wrong is your casting, your approach to the whole thing. And these things go wrong first. And I think a lot of so-called refusals were essentially I found that out. I'm not just thinking this. I did this myself so many times that I gradually realized that you can't just walk up here like a gunnery sergeant, and just, stand on the shore, start firing away at these fish, because you had to get down on your hands and knees in the nettles, stay still. And the guy that's doing that to the best right now in the UK is Paul Proctor. You know him well, I'm sure. But that guy's on his knees most of the time, waiting it out. So that's the New Zealand approach. And it works here too. So this is all just all these different guys. Like they've been obviously been at it for years and discovering these things through discussions and what people write. But a lot of it's been fishing with guides, of course. This has permeated the whole culture now, because these guys aren't doing it for a living. Like, if you're guiding for a living, then it's really important. You really have to make the best of that experience for this client of yours. So you can't waste time or effort, and you have to show them how to do it. And that now I think has probably pretty much permeated the entire fly fishing culture. And I think it's a great thing, that with catch and release and doing it for the experience rather than the grip and grin picture. Although that's important to people, of course. Yes, that's the way fly fishing is now, and we've got lots of company out there. So I think it's even more important that you make the best possible of your opportunities. And that's where we are.
Yeah. It was you talking about the Klinkhammer Special, and I remember when that came out commercially, that it was a large fly and it was designed for fast water for grayling, wasn't it? It was a caddis pattern, and how that's permeated into so many different things and part of a setup. And I think a lot of it, because of it being designed for fast water, being easy to spot in heads of pools and things like that. Do you think now that these things, that the thought process, and it may have been at that time that you had a fledgling internet, that you could share ideas via email or via forums, but now that process is so much quicker, isn't it, via social media and everything that goes with it?
Well, that's absolutely right. And I don't know if you know Hans Wellenman in Holland. He was right from the start. He was on to the internet. He was a big influence for me as well. And his moniker is Fly Tire, and he runs his own website there called Fly Tire's Page, and he's just interested in all. He's a real fly tire, and that's the way he comes at it. But all kinds of flies. But we had quite a bit of interaction, and he took the photographs for my first book for me. But we were talking about these things a lot, and you can see if you go back and you look at, especially if you date them, you can actually see the progression of thinking work through. He's a good source for that, actually. You can sort of see the progression of thinking as different tires. They start off back there doing something, and gradually, as they're through the career, their fly tying sort of changes because it coalesces into a style. And the clink hammer, interestingly enough, and you'll know this, but some of your listeners might not, is that so Hans van Klinken was fishing for grayling on these rivers, and although that's generally accepted as some kind of caddis pattern, if you really look at the clink hammer special, that is not a caddis pattern. I mean, what is it, right? Well, it looks to me like it's an emerger pattern, but it has some of the aspects of a conventional parachute fly with the sunk body, right, and the wing post. But so this is really odd. So this actually really worked, say, in a caddis hatch on these fast flowing streams. So why would that be? This is the question. These kind of questions always come up when you find something that actually does work. And it doesn't seem, because Van Klinken actually refers to an earlier fly that inspired that fly, which is the Rackelhannen, which is a mop. Mm-hmm. It's obviously styled on a caddis, but it's just a clump of stuff on the surface. So I think it was more the realization that close copy approach wasn't necessarily the most important thing. There had to be some resemblance going on there, but it was that close copy approach wasn't the most important thing. And how he got to the clink hammer special is remarkable, because here's this fly, and he surprises himself. He's putting this huge fly out there, say in a caddis hatch for grayling, which I've seen can get pretty hard to catch sometimes. And not just doing well, but doing remarkably well and pulling up big fish. So now you can't find an instant answer to why that's happening, but it certainly gets you asking some questions. And it got me asking questions. So I just played around with these ideas. So you had Fran Better's usual and his haystack, and you had Kochi's compare done. You had Swisher and Rich's no hackle done, paraduns. And you had this revolutionary fly that some people say there were guys, I think it was Craig Matthews, I'm not sure, someone in the States came up with a very similar fly, roughly the same time. And some people think there was a similar fly called the First Choice that evolved in New Zealand, but I think that's suspect, because I think it was really, I don't think Van Klinken was in touch with whoever was coming up with this sunk abdomen style fly in the States, but roughly all at the same time this happened. And that's a revolutionary thing, because it just jumped away from the selective trout, the strong version of selective trout theory, into something else. And so at that time, this is now in the sort of mid-90s, I started playing around with these ideas. And that's when I came up with we'll talk about another fly that's close to the Rackelhannen that I've used since I've been 11 years old, which is the deer hair sedge. I call it deer hair sedge. And it's now, I would call it it's a generalized pattern. It's been around forever in various forms. But so I was already fishing this kind of impressionistic fly with great success all through my life. And so I came up with this sunk body version that I tried, and instantly, these are Scottish locks, thought it was absolutely deadly, right? On flat, when people in Scotland, nowadays there's a lot of dry fly fishermen around, proper good dry fly fishermen on these locks, but back then there wasn't. Even as recent as the 90s, wasn't done. It was all pulled, sunk, attractor flies. This thing, on a glassy day, right? High pressure day, water like a mirror. Nobody's going to go out on these locks and fish for trout. That just wasn't done. You just sat there and went to the pub or something. What I found was you throw this deer emerger out there and let it sit, right? You'd get fish, quite a few fish. Sometimes you get phenomenal numbers of fish. And this really got us going as a group. that combined with the old deer hair sedge, which I just used all the time. If there was any kind of wind, I just put the sedge on, and that just did the business. Always, always remarkable fly. So that right there was a change in. I guess this would be about mid-90s. I really started to by the time I went to New Zealand, I had my prototype deer hair emerger with me on my first trip to New Zealand, and it worked spectacularly well. So I came back from that thinking, okay, now I've got to fly. So I started, using it and talking about it in my articles back then, and that's the way I think fly tying really works. But I was going to say earlier, there's kind of a split there. We're talking about people, if you're a guide, you want a set of flies that's going to work. But also think if you're a fisherman, you want that same set of flies. You want to have your little clutch of go-to flies that you're going to work. Then there's fly tying. Now, fly tying is a fantastic thing, right? It's got a long set of traditions. It's fascinating, and it's huge. There are now hundreds of thousands of people tying flies, and they're not tying standard patterns anymore. They're inventing and creating flies, right? That's what fly tying is now. So naturally, I think people quite naturally, like I do, or you may, you really want to think that your invention, this is the one. This is the fly. What I'm doing to this fly is going to make all the difference. So it'll be some trigger or some whatever it is, that you've added to your fly. And of course, usually it works. Sometimes it really works well. It makes a difference. And those are things that stand out over time. Certain flies have certain things that make a difference. Now butt in any time, Pete, if I'm rabbiting on here. But the deer hair sedge, as you know, is a very simple fly. I first saw it back in about 1957 when I was just a kid, 11 years old, and fishing down my dad's home waters down in the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta. And there was a fly tie there named Jerry Avellito. And he had a little fly tie shop, Jerry's sports shop. He was a fly tyer. And he had all the standard flies. Most people were wet fly fishermen back then on those waters. But he had this fly that he tied himself. He had all the standard patterns, but he bought them. They were English tied flies. They were actually tied in England. And they were usually, I don't know if you remember these things, they were usually on cardboard, strips of cardboard in packs of 3. And they'd be, with all the classic patterns, and quite a few of the North American patterns, but quite a few British patterns. And a lot of them were on snelled. They had about a 6-inch nylon or monofilament snell on them, because that's the way people fish. They'd have loops in their leader, and they'd attach 3 flies and fish down and across, and always caught lots of fish. But somehow, Jerry Avellito had this fly that he called the bucktail. Now, that makes me wonder if he actually knew what a bucktail was, because it isn't a bucktail. It's a dry fly. It's now what we see as a classic deer hair sort of sedge type pattern. And it had a really fat orange wool body, big clump of deer hair strapped to the back of it, and a brown hackle wound over top of that hackle. So it wasn't a pretty fly. And I don't think he was the greatest fly tyer. It wasn't all that neat. But I was young, by the time I was 12 and 13, I was tying my own flies. So, I could tie that fly pretty well. That was our fly for these mountain streams. You could not beat it. There was nothing that worked as good or better than that fly. And we used to plaster it with mucilin paste. This fast water fly. You could see it. And it was irresistible. These cutthroats and especially the cutthroats, the wild cutthroats of the mountain streams, fast mountain streams. It was just murder. So everybody had to have that fly, you see. And that thing over time, we used it all the time. That was the bucktail. And it had to be orange. It's orange chenille body, usually. And because that was easier to tie than wool. But by the time I was maybe, 15 or 16, they weren't all that well because of the way they were tied. You just put a hackle over top of it, of clump deer hair and stuff. That things got a little bit loose, and after a couple of fish, invariably the hackle would come loose. And I just pull it off, just pull it out. They'd be stringing behind and splitting things. You just pull it off. And I found that the fly worked just as well, maybe better without the hackle, you see. So that's what I started doing. And I just played around with that idea until by the time I was in my 20s, I was fishing what I called my version of it. It was just a very simple, just a usually seal's fur or something body, and a good sized clump of deer hair on the front, and just kind of clipping the butts into sort of a semi-muddlery sort of head. I didn't try and cover them up anymore, and that was just it's still my go-to. It's still my go-to fly. Maybe I tie them skinny and I tie them fat, and in any hatch, it's just a matter of size. And if it's skinny enough, it'll match just about anything that's happening. And I'm talking about some pretty difficult situations on flat water with rising fish to very delicate, say deletidium flies or whatever we get up here at various stages of the hatch. It still pulls up as many fish as anything else I use. Now, that's probably too extreme for most guys because they like fly tying too much, and there's more to talk about flies than just finding something that works most of the time, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot to fly fishing, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you say about that caddis pattern as well, because I'm sitting there thinking you're saying about, the development of these patterns, and obviously the one that you subsequently from your local fly tire, and then you took the hackle off. You had Al Troth over in Montana with the elk hair caddis as well, which you're probably predating that, I would think. That must be a 70s, 80s pattern, mustn't it? He was out in Montana.
70s.
Yeah.
I talked to Al Troth about that. And he figures it wasn't Bud Lilly's Fly Shop was the first place it was commercially sold. And Troth said that he was basing that on the little red sedge, Skew's little red sedge, only with deer hair, right? And but it was that's the way he tied it with that full body hackle. And that was about 1971. I think it wasn't in the shop until about then. So yeah, but there were other vaguely similar deer hair patterns kicking around in the West where there were deer. Fishermen used to shoot deer, in those days, or they had friends who did. And you always found a use for something like that. So you had a whole deer hide there. And so you'd think, well, I'll try a wing of that, and of course it just became one of the materials that people have that. And the other thing is it floated, of course, without much help. So that was kind of a Western thing. And Troth said something else to me because we talked about this development fly thing quite a bit. And I was telling him about that. I said, yeah, I grew up with a kind, not really that similar fly because there's no body hackle on it. But that's the only difference. And ours was much larger. His remark was usually slightly smaller patterns. The sedge we were using was big. It was always a 10 or sometimes even bigger. But we had big flies. We had big stone flies and, big caddis hatching. So we tended to just think we were still representing something. But Trout said, well, he said, we talked about this, how a fly became so famous. But I think that was, fishing Yellowstone and all these famous rivers down in Montana. This was back in the Joe Brooks era. He made Western Montana fishing famous through outdoor life. And so that's that first loop, the information loop we were talking about well before the internet. This is back in the 60s and that. So when a fly was purchased, say at Bud Lilly's shop, that's where people went to get their flies. They got them at his shop. There are other shops, but that was the main one. So if you were coming from New York to go trout fishing in Montana, of course you went to Bud Lilly's shop. And he'd say, that fly works, and he'd take a dozen of those. And of course it got used. And as Al Troth said to me, he says, flies make them, good fly will make itself famous. You didn't have to push it. fishermen just started using it, catching fish with it, and it became a very, very famous fly. Almost on a separate, that was south of the border to us. So we had a different sort of more British tradition up in Canada, and we didn't have anything like. I mean, I remember we were kids camping on the Crow's Nest, and I bumped into a couple of American fishermen. I don't know where they were staying, but they weren't camping. I think they were pretty well heeled. And they had cowboy hats, and what you associate now with Joe Brooks sort of style of fishing. They're fishing the Crow's Nest. And they said something that absolutely stunned me. They said they were fishing for brown trout. Now, I didn't know the Crow's Nest River had brown trout in it. It was just a rainbow trout fishery with a few cutthroats in it. They're fishing below. There's a falls on a barrier, falls, quite a steep one that stops fish from moving upstream. And below that, there were brown trout. They'd been stocked there by some, displaced Englishmen many, many years before to try and get some proper trout in the river. And these guys, I couldn't believe what they're fishing. They were fishing with these huge streamers. They were at least a size 4 or a 2. Great big, like a low water salmon hook, long shank, black body ribbed with silver tinsel, and then a great big swatch of bright yellow bucktail on the top of it. And I couldn't believe it. Come on, they had it. They're both on their leaders right there, and they were seriously fishing for big brown trout. Now, this has got to be late 50s. It's late 50s, probably maybe as late as 1960, something like that. I was a kid. I'd never seen anything like that. Never saw anything like that after that. Until now, people fish big streamers on these rivers, of course, for big trout. I do. But these boys were onto something that was an entirely different, wavelength. These were serious trout fishermen that were like, I don't know who they've been talking to, but nobody that I knew. but they were spending. They'd come all the way up there from wherever it was in the States to fish this river for big brown trout with giant streamers. I've never heard of it.
Wow.
And I wore that streamer in my hat for years, without ever tying it on my line. I wouldn't dare. It was just impossible to think.
Wow.
But now, of course, I look back, and then, of course, they knew exactly what they were doing. I've got pals in New Zealand who fish these streamers all the time, especially in the early season and that they're fishing these, and they're bigger streamers, Kelly Galoop style, 6 dungeons and things like this. They're just monstrosities. They're 5 inches long, huge deer hair heads on them. Big fish come roaring across the river to nail them. And nobody knew that. Nobody had any idea that could even happen.
Yeah.
How do we get to where
well, this is just, you said about cutting in, but I'm so enjoying listening to you. I know this one, I'm not going to apologise to our listeners because this is going to run over, and rightly it should, because there's so much to talk about as well. And I wanted to talk about, you can see how your thought process has been growing. You've been writing articles. The deer hair emerger, I think you're being incredibly modest about, was, your look at the Klinkhammer special. And I believe when I read those articles and subsequently the book, that you said it was a little bit easier to tie, yet would sit in the water in a similar way. That started to happen. Yeah. You're using it in New Zealand. You're test driving it. It's working. You're starting to work on the book. And that brings me nicely on to the first book and the second one as well, to tie it in, because first off, I want to say that when I was researching for this podcast, and I own both the books and I've read them a number of times, and reading through them again coming into this podcast, what an impact they had on me as an angler and how I looked at fishing, how I approached it, and how a bigger part of my fishing career they've actually been, and be it consciously and subconsciously, what an impact they had. And I really liked the there was no crap about it. You said how it was, but it was well reasoned and well thought out. And it was coming from a different angle. It wasn't trying to mystify fly fishing. It was trying to say, look, these are things we should be thinking about. And you've alluded to some of those already. Does that mean that when you wrote those books, that was the approach that you wanted to have in mind? And there's so much information in them. And, the first one was published in 94. And that's not that long ago now, but they're still incredibly pertinent now. As a fly angler, I can read them and think, yes, these still make a lot of sense. Was that the route you were looking to go with them?
Well, actually, when I trout hunting was sort of these trips up into northern Scotland, and this group of us would sit around in a pub talking, and my pals were saying, because we were talking about this stuff just like we're talking about it now, talking about like, why is this happening? What's that? And people would be arguing strenuously for the Cape McLaren or the Blue Zulu or something, and I'd be saying, well, I don't know, but you have to face facts here because we're catching more with this fly than those flies, and why is that happening? And the interesting thing then, I'm just sort of setting the stage for, or the situation for how I got into writing the book. And then Bob and a couple of other guys saying, we should be writing this stuff down, just get it out there. Because I was writing articles for Fly Fishing Fly Tying. They said, there's probably a book there. So I thought, well, is there? I still don't know if it wasn't a complete book, because I had to put some stories and yarns in there just to kind of pad it out a bit, I think. But my thinking has evolved, I guess you want to put it, even since writing that first book. And that's, I try to get at it in trout hunting, because another pal in New Zealand said, you got to have another crack at this, because I think there's people they don't know what you're saying. They think you're sort of just arguing against, say, the selective trout theory or something, which of course I am, but only in its effects. It doesn't bother me that people, of course it doesn't bother me that people are spending huge amounts of time trying to get absolutely perfect imitations of tiny flies to use on the slicks of the Snake River, for a particular moment in a highly pressurized, but that's fine. That's what fly fishing is all about. But I was just interested in this, is that I use the word mystification. It's almost a religious belief system about what trout are and how they work. Now, that's what got me interested. That's what got me into all this behaviorist stuff with Nicholas Tinbergen and the ethologists. That's the approach. And the supernormal releaser, which that's what I think is going on with the Klinkhammer Special. That's what's really going on there, I believe. It's not about imitation there. It's about there's certain elements of that fly that trigger a response. And if you're talking about feeding fish, now you're not going to catch fish that aren't feeding. Very seldom you're going to do that. You can trigger some kind of response, but that's generally we're waiting for a feeding period. And then what you really want, doesn't matter what's in your fly, really. I don't mind if people want to put tags and tinsel and legs and all kinds of stuff on their fly. Great, that's fly time. But what you really have to have in there are certain essential elements that are going to trigger that response. And that's what interested me, is the behavioral response. Now, this isn't entirely accepted by everybody, because especially among fly tiers, because there's because there are just aspects that they want to do this. They want to fly tires will tie flies. That's just what it is. Good on them, And some people love to use the traditional patterns because they're fantastic. I mean, still some of my favorite flies are the wet spiders that have been around for God knows how long, 200 years. But that's, of course, you do that. But what interested me, got me writing the book, was what I was starting to think, what trout were doing, what their behavior was really like. And that's just fascinating, because that's what this is all about. I mean, it's not just about catching fish. It's about this connection that you have with these amazing creatures that have been there since the last ice age, and evolving and living in these fantastic places that you get to go to and do this pursuit that we've invented, that I don't know. I suppose I don't like think of it as a game, but it's certainly let's call it a pastime. That's kind of a gloss there, but we can turn it into a game, and that's where I think the imitative side tends to go. Is they you want to make a game of it, right? You want to say, no, that fish knows he's being fished for, and he's so sophisticated and he's educated by fishing that he'll actually go hungry rather than eat a particular fly. Now that's putting it really kind of too simply, but at its basis, at its core, that's what you're saying. So really, that becomes more about you than it does the fish. This is about me outsmarting this really smart opponent out there, which is kind of a game, right? And what you've come up with to convince that really smart, educated creature that's out there suspiciously rising to a fly and deciding whether it's a fake fly or not. Now, to me, that's just a stretch too far. That's not what that fish is doing. That fish is trying to eat, right? That's to do. If it's a big fish, he really wants to eat because he has to. So it's that trout's behavior. It's that really, really interesting. So I wouldn't go so far as to say it's actually scientific, because I think you have to go at things in science. You have to go at things in a different way. We as fishermen get to kind of, we can range around and try stuff out, and we have all sorts of. Most of it is anecdotal. Everything we think about fly fishing, mostly anecdotal, but there's some science in there as well. And that's these behaviorists were sort of onto it, not necessarily with trout, although they are now. They're looking at these things and deciding just how smart are trout.
That's really interesting. Oh, sorry, Bob. I was going to say that's a really interesting point, because, and I should say as well, sorry, I meant to say the book was published in 2004, not 94. But do you think then, what you're saying there has got me thinking that, are we anthropomorphizing the trout too much? And is that a reason for not catching it, when we should really look at ourselves and say, right, is it our casting? Is it our approach? Have we spooked it? Do you think that's where part of your process is with that as well? And how we sort of justify, in some cases, not catching that educated trout, and it's more for what we're doing wrong, not that trout's smarter than we are?
Well, yes. Well, I think it's pretty clear to anybody that looks at a trout. And if you've gone even further, and I've dissected a few trout, when I was young, working with the Pacific Salmon Commission, we know what a trout's brain looks like, right? And of course, we're smarter than a trout. We've got this huge brain, right? And we think differently than a trout. So that absolutely, fly fishing has largely been anthropomorphizing trout. We are reading trout behavior in anthropomorphic terms. There's no question. I mean, this idea of suspicion and more. I mean, in the old days, they talked about, maybe it was a sense of taste and things like that. I mean, if you're a Victorian fly fisher on a trout stream, it was all about taste, you see. So you did things a certain way, and the trout had to be of a certain caliber of quarry to make it worthwhile, you see. So, and that obviously, now that looks silly, actually. Although, boy, they were serious. The great arguments between Skews and Alfred, the split in thinking was precisely over that. Skews is talking behavior. Sawyer was talking behavior. He wasn't talking, elevating these creatures to some fantastical level of intelligence and style and sophistication. And they really were. And that has taken a long time. I mean, we don't really think of them that way now. But it held sway for 100 years, just about 100 years. So it's a long time. So, well, not 100, but it's a good part of the 20th century. That's how you approach trout. So, yeah. This, and I think it's a barrier to understanding and making this connection. Whereas if you're once you start. That's why I called that first book Trout Hunting. I wanted to say, oh, this is different. This is hunting. And to be a good hunter, you really have to understand your quarry, know what they do and what they think like, what they behave like anyway. And that's what the really best fly fishermen, most guides, I think, are good fly fishermen, and some of them are unbelievably good fly fishermen. I know I've got pals in New Zealand that they're phenomenally good fly fishermen. I mean, guys like Simon Chu and Chris Dorr, and there are others. Like there's a big long list of these guys. They do it for a living, of course. But I mean, it's what they can do. Ronan Crane, this Irish friend who's moved there from Ireland, is I mean, it's incredible where they can pull a fish from and how they do it. And they've all got different flies. They now these days they share more characteristics than they used to. And they've all got favorites, of course. But they're if you really look at them as a class of fly, they're similar. And that's all based on they're not anthropomorphizing the fish. They're just as romantic and sentimental about them as you and I are. I mean, I can weep when I think about what's happening to some rivers and fish. And I'm not going to get out of this discussion without mentioning one thing. Like I've done a fair amount of salmon fishing and steelhead fishing, but this idea of sentimentalizing, romanticizing things, if we're that sentimental about fish, we should really be looking at what's happening to some of our rivers in terms of sewage and pollution. And up here, we have got a salmon farm problem. I mean, if you're a salmon fisherman at all, or a sea trout fisherman up in Scotland, we have a serious issue. This thing, the government is going at this hell bent for leather on this thing. There are hundreds of these things, and they're creeping down further south all the time as they've used up all the available space up the west coast. And it's killed off the wild Atlantic salmon population almost entirely on the west coast of Scotland. And they're carrying on with this. They want to double this. And fishermen have to take more of an interest in this rather than just a game, or a pastime. I mean, if it's meaningful, and it is, I mean, I believe it's the most meaningful thing in my life, actually, is trout fishing and salmon fishing and saltwater fishing, and like with Peter Morrison, and that's his life, right? There are other people like that, and if it's become part of your livelihood, even more so, you have to step up. You have to step up, and I mean raise hell. Forget your party allegiances and everything else, but really go for these politicians that are local and otherwise that are allowing this stuff to happen. It's happening fast. So sorry. I didn't want to turn this into
No, you're dead right, Bob, and we've tried really hard by this podcast and our magazine to highlight those. Yeah. In our magazine, we had Michael Frodin interviewed about salmon farms. Yeah. We're trying really hard, and I think one of the pushes I'm going to have coming into Christmas is try to push people not to eat smoked salmon or farm smoked salmon at Christmas. And I think that's something as anglers we could all do and push that and the sewage aside as well. We need to push that. But I think we need to constantly be in the public psyche and in their view, because I think with the way social media is, things happen quickly and people move on to the next thing. And we've got this background of the COP meeting that's just finished now, that we need to carry on with that baton and run with it a little bit further. And I think Christmas is a great case for arguing for getting people not to eat salmon. And that's something I'm looking into and I'm working on at the moment as well, to highlight that and to a wider population as well.
That's excellent, Pete. Absolutely right, because it's a juggernaut, in terms of the world. I mean, it's a juggernaut. It's a huge shareholder deal and all this kind of stuff. So it's big. It's huge, and it's going to be very difficult to turn it around. But we just have to do something, because it's like you say, it's really happening fast with tremendous effects, and social media is an incredibly powerful instrument in turning things around. It can happen. It's not hopeless, because you give these fish a chance. They bound back. They respond. I mean, the Clyde right now has returning salmon runs. The Clyde runs right through the middle of Glasgow. It has a good, healthy population of and it's increasing, of wild fish, and it's that kind of thing. It hasn't been able to. It's probably been able to support some kind of fish, downstream of Glasgow, but not very many. It's a heavily polluted river, but now it's not. You can turn it around. So that's what that we have to keep that. I mean, this is a fascinating pursuit. It'll last you all your life. It'll save your life, I think. Fly fishing, there's no question. But this has to be part of the deal now. It's what I think, and obviously you do too. So, strength to your arm there.
Yeah, no, we'll try everything we can to push that. But I wanted to come back to the books and the second one as well. Okay. What Trout Want, and it seems to me as though in that one it was in the first one, but what you were seeing and what you were witnessing in New Zealand gave you, I guess, fuel to write some more about it. And I know I'm trying to remember now about a fish you were talking about, actually. And because I was going to talk about educated trout, and I think we sort of debunked that quite nicely. But you're talking about a time you're fishing with Carl McNeil on a river, and a fish is rising and you're covering it. It's not eating. And then he's saying change pattern. And you eventually actually catch that fish. What do we learn from that process? Would it be, I sometimes think a fish might be having have a dominant side. It may be the way that flows there, that it is just quietly going to the left rather than the right. Where do you stand on those sorts of things if we get the chance to observe the behavior of a feeding fish?
I stand exactly where you are on this, actually, as it turns out, because I remember there's two instances like that fishing with Carl. And that one, Carl called it at that time. I remember him saying, he said, no, he says, keep at that fish, Bob, because I was fishing downstream of it. He said, that's a happy fish. He's not spooked. And we could tell because he wasn't lying that poker straight way when you've got a fish that's just alert and just going to take off at any moment. So he said, no, keep on this fish. He hasn't spooked. He looks happy to me. So, but what I finally did was I cast to the other side of him. That's what I did. Now, I don't know what happened there, but it could be a couple of things. It could be maybe he was seeing that tippet come too near to him and it just kind of put him off. Like, what's that? Kind of thing, just unsettled him or whatever. Or he had a dominant side. Now, for even just momentarily dominant, just happened to be preferring to go with the left and the right. Now, this is the kind of thing that we don't hear much about, but these fish they're a funny critter, and sure enough, I put that fly on the other side of him, up became happy as Larry, and he was on. But and another time, I was fishing on another river with Carl several years later, and we saw a fish rising tight close to the blank. Good fish. I was riding steadily, really going. There's a good hatch of these Delatidium mayflies on. And Carl was going for him. And I think most of his casts, they must have been going to the stream side rather than the bank side. And this thing would not look at his flies. So, as we all do, sooner or later, although he was quite confident when he started, eventually you start thinking, gee, maybe it's my fly, right? So although he's a firm believer in what I say because he's my friend, sometimes he just laughs. He's just saying, oh my God, it's my fly. So he started changing flies. Nothing. Then he says, come on, he's still rising, Bob. What's going on? So I went up and I still had the same old, I didn't change flies or anything. Just went up the same old fly. And I tried him for a few times, just like Carl had been doing. I figured, what's going on with this fish? I put it right on top. I was trying to keep the tippet away from getting in front of him or coming too close to him, which was tricky because we were straight downstream of him. And finally, I said, I just popped, there's only about 6 inches to the bank. I just popped the fly to the bank, just took it immediately, right? Immediately. So Carl said, well, what have you got on? As if it was the fly. It was the same fly I'd been using all day. So it wasn't that at all. It was that. And that was, again, it was a perfect example of that fish just at that time preferred to be taken. That's what he was watching for the fly. Maybe there's something about the current there. There's something that made him prefer going to the left and the right. Now that's real. That is guide stuff. I mean, I know I've fished with these, like Simon Shue has. I've been in a situation where I'm covering a fish time and time again. Just keep going. And come on, the thing is coming up, and you can see him beautiful. The head and tail rises. My fly is going an inch from where he's rising. Still, he's not going for it. And then I remember this one time Simon is an incredibly good fisherman, but there's something oriental about his approach, because suddenly Simon just appeared as if he'd kind of transported himself to the other side of the stream. Suddenly my peripheral vision, what are you doing over there? He said, "Do you mind if I have a go for him?" I said, "Yeah, go at it." Boom. He was into it instantly. So it was like, I don't know what was going on there, but it was clearly, it was the angle that I was on, or something was going on there. It had nothing to do with the fly pattern at all. So that kind of thing, just, you remember those moments, and they inform you, through your life. They stick. They just stick.
Yeah.
So that's the happy fish.
Yeah. It's interesting because while you were telling that story, it made me, and you say, "Oh, we think the same," but I'm sure I've been influenced by what I've read in your books, so that's probably the reason. But I remember I was invited to fish the Itchin, and there was a chap covering the fish and couldn't. He said, "You have a go." And I remember that moment where it really clicked into place, exactly as you said, exactly the same situation, that we could see it rising, nothing. I covered it. I said, "Look, I'm going to try it tighter to the bank." It was out, I don't know, half a foot from the bank on the far side, and threw it into the bank straight away. And that's when that made me, I'm sure, influenced, like I say, by your books, and consciously or subconsciously as well, but also thinking, yes, that, there might be something about this dominant side thing, and it made me think about it. But it's also some of the things you said there. Do you think drag as dry fly anglers is probably the key thing we need to come to terms with and control and to manage?
Yep. Well, definitely. There's two big things. If you dry fly fish, well, not just dry fly fishing, of course, but definitely dry fly fishing. There's a couple of things you have to get right. And one is the angle of the approach, because you do not want that tippet crossing the fish's line. It may not just be crossing the fish itself, but it's somebody, as you know, they've got this sort of tunnel that they're looking through there, and you don't want that tippet appearing there, especially if it's on flat water. On fast water, it's not so important, but you don't want that, because if it appears, it's not even the tippet itself, because they will take a fly off a piece of grass. I've seen them do it. It's not that. It's that it suddenly appears. It wasn't there. Now it's there. Now these fish are just that kind of creature. Everything's going on happily. Fly, eat, fly. They're just happily just doing what they're doing, and then suddenly something different comes into their vision, and they just stiffen up. That's it. They're just like, what was that? They don't know what it was. Of course they don't. They certainly don't know it's you with, standing back there with a fly rod. They don't know any of that. But that's just something happened there. And I'm not, that wasn't happening. Now it is. And it just puts them off a bit. Now that's one thing that can happen. And the other worst thing that can happen is that you've made what you think is a good presentation, and you've got the right angle, and your drift is looking good. And somehow the current down here, let's say you're towards the tail of a pool, where things start to speed up again, and you get that little belly on the line, and it just starts to pull on the line, which of course is eventually attached to your fly, and you can't see it. It looks like a perfect drift, and it'll just start moving that fly in a way that it wasn't doing before. So it's kind of the same idea. It's not that the fish suddenly thinks, "Oh, that fly's fake," because it's not moving properly. It's just that what was happening is now no longer happening. That fly's doing something different. Sometimes, of course, they'll chase a fly. A real hard-feeding fish, of course, will go after it anyway. But often, especially, big spooky fish that finally get the nerve to, big trout are usually low-light feeders. If you get a big fish feeding out in the daytime, because there's enough food coming down, and they get the nerve up and they come out just because the feed is coming down. They just have to. They come out and they get into position, but boy, they've got their escape routes, and there's two stages. Some guides have said this to me. Is they think you've got a semi-spook situation. I don't know if I actually go along with that, because I think if you see a fish stiffen, like just since he was doing this happily waiting for something to come down, and they suddenly go in this kind of stiff way. They just sink a bit, and they just go down a bit and stiffen. They go sort of Ramrod Street. He's ready to go. Now, that's not semi-spook. That's spook. That's the next thing that happens is probably going to send him for the banks. That's what's going on there. So there, and that could be something as subtle as just this little bit of drag, or it might not even be the fly. It might just be the tippet that you wouldn't pay any attention to if it didn't do that. But just as your line starts to tighten, the tippet starts to move on the surface. He doesn't know what's happening. The fish doesn't know what's going on there, but it's something different. And a wary fish that, or has been wary for most of the time, finally come out into the open to feed, will bolt or stiffen. Sometimes they don't spook entirely, so you think, no, he's still okay, and you'll keep fishing for him. Nope, nothing. And the no sail, and this, I've fished over a lot of fish like that in New Zealand. You think you've seen a fish that's in a feeding position. There's no reason for him not to come for the fly. It doesn't matter what you do. He just kind of sulks. He just goes stiff, and they have a look to them. They're stiff, and usually they're down. They go down to the bottom. They're not hanging in mid-water anymore. These are the signs that I think it's only experience, especially guides, because they're doing it every day. They start noticing these kind of things, and they're guiding somebody into, so don't stand there, come over here, just wait for this fish to show some signs of being relaxed, and or especially if he starts rising again. That sort of stuff. Mostly it's that. It's that the angle of presentation, light, the light shadows and flashes from lines, or drag. So drag that's like, I agree, it's probably number one. And long before you get down to fly pattern, these things are important. Of course, you have to have a reasonable fly on, but get those things right, you've got a very good chance of getting that fish to eat. Very seldom is he going to pass on something that looks good and it's coming down. It's easy to get at. So, yeah, that's
nice.
The drag.
Yeah, nice. I think you're dead right, and we've tried to talk about it previously: patience, observation, and those tips about the fish. I don't know if you've noticed it, that sometimes if you think they're interested, that tail goes a little bit quicker as well.
Absolutely.
And yes. Sometimes it'll come up and you can see it speeds a bit. I don't know if that is to move up or whatever. You see that tail move a little bit, and those little things. And as we've said, and it's great hearing you say it as well, Bob, that watch a little bit, take a bit of time, don't shoot out that shot straight away.
Take your time.
Yeah, and try and figure out where it is. And I guess, coming back to what we said about dominant sides as well, that by watching, you may get, particularly if it's in a clear river, you're getting a good sense of where that dominant side might be and where to put that fly. So was this process, writing these books, a fun and interesting one? And did you get plenty out of it as well?
Oh, no, absolutely. That's a great thing, but that's the most fun part of writing is rewriting. That's the real enjoyable part. I think both those books had about 10 complete rewrites from word for word all the way through them, because you just have to keep saying that's a bit ambiguous, or that's a bit vague, or what do I really mean that, or what does that sound like I'm saying? And if you keep doing that, be really, really critical, but it's incredibly good fun. Especially if you finally get something. Now, I think in trout hunting, I probably overdid that, because what trout hunting was not trout hunting, but what trout want. I think what I was really trying to do there was say, okay, now I know all of these guys out there. There's thousands of fly fishermen, and everybody's got an opinion, right? And everybody's got an argument, right? So if I say this, there is an argument against that. And so I had to anticipate that argument. And so I tend to repeat myself quite a bit. I'm saying, no, I'm not ignoring that about what I think that trout is doing there. But I'm afraid I'm just going to have to say this one more time, is that this covers that. This what I'm saying about fish behavior here covers that as well. Mostly it comes down to, I think things like presentation, that's Bible. There's nobody has ever argued with me about presentation anywhere. It's not like I'm inventing this stuff. They've come up with it themselves. Presentation is 90% of the game. But it comes down to fly pattern and things like that, and what the fly is actually going for. Here's where you get your arguments. Mostly they're from fly tires, I have to have to say. But I'm a fly tire. I've tied flies all my life. Got nothing against it. But the arguments are fly tires arguments, because they really want to believe that, that yellow tag made all the difference that day. They refused everything else all day long. Not a fish, nothing. They put that on, bam, Now, most of the time, that's because the fish came on the feed and you were fishing at the time. Now you can have the wrong thing on, but it's never as wrong as you think it is. Most of our flies still fall into, in terms of size and things like that, they fall into they're not that far apart. And it's the same freshwater, saltwater. It's always the same. The fish come on and you look at your fly with amazement. You say, man, that's the killer. So you go tie a couple of thousand of them, and that's now the fly, the only fly I'll use. This is why, right? Whoops. I think we lost you there.
Yep. No, I'm still here, Bob.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
I'm still here, Bob. Don't you worry about that. And it seems to me as well in the books and coming back to them, and like I say, they had a huge influence on me for many reasons. And one of them, there's two things actually I want to bring up before we start winding up. But one of them was the importance of good fishing friends. And one I've talked about on previous podcasts is being in the zone. And you talk about where you're fishing with Hans Wellman and, you'd been fishing hard and were in the zone. And, you describe sort of waggling your line out and getting it out, and a great big fish comes and eats the fly straight away. And you're trying to, and that of being used, even those moments, if you weren't fishing a lot, waggling your fly out and the fish eating may take you by surprise. But if you're in the zone, having been doing a lot of fishing, that comes naturally and instinctively really, really quickly, doesn't it? And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about the zone and then about fishing friends as well, because, like I say, it's had an impact on how I suppose, interview a potential fishing friend as well.
Well, that's really, really important, Pete. Absolutely. That I was actually just trying to be funny with that story about Hans. I mean, it was true that happened, but I know why, because Hans had traveled all the way from Holland to fish there, in southern Alberta on streams that I knew, and I'd been at it. I'd been there for months. I mean, I'd fished every day. I mean, I actually, when the fish are on, and they were to those few days, I mean, seriously, that's the zone. You just cannot do anything wrong, and it's not because you're totally relaxed about it. That is for sure, because you've just been doing it so much recently. And you're not really thinking anymore about whatever you are doing, but just because it'd be like a football player. Now, a football player is not suddenly thinking, "Oh, gee, here comes, that's a pass coming to me. Now I'm going to, I'm going to have to head this ball," or something like that. He's not thinking at all, right? It's just he just does it. Now that's what the zone is. Probably one of the finest, most enjoyable states of being that human beings can have is to be in the zone when you're fly fishing, because everything's going your way. The fish are on, you're on, everything's great, you're relaxed about it, just having a whale of a time, and especially if you're with people that you enjoy being with. Now, okay, we're on to something really, really important here. Now, Hans is a great guy. He actually was the first person on that trip to identify a creep problem in my casting. I mean, he says, "Wyatt, you're a creep." And I says, "Wow." He wasn't referring to the fishing. It was my casting. He's an expert caster. I didn't know. What are you talking about? I didn't know what I was doing. He told me right then and there. He says, "Get that rod back there, wait, and leave it there." I can remember him saying it, "Leave it there." And so that was the first time anybody had identified anything in my casting. So I'd probably been fishing for 35 years or 40 years with that. A lot of people are. That's one of the most common casting problems there is, and so that it was that kind of banter all the time with Hans. He's a great guy to fish with. He knows his stuff, and that was because Hans actually, as I relate to the story, Hans actually started that competition. I'm one thing I was going to say, I do not like competition when I'm fishing. I do not enjoy it at all. But this was a friendly, bantery thing where he said, "Let the best fly win, Wyatt," right? Because he had his CDC and elk, which is a fantastic fly. I don't tie it, but only because I just don't mess with CDC. Hans is a fly tire, so he loves doing this. He's sitting over there, picking the perfect, CDC feathers to just the right size, got a number 2, whatever it is, with just the right thickness of stem, all this kind of. He loves that stuff. And so he should. He's fly tire, right? So he's got this great fly, which essentially does all the things that my deer sedge does. It's the same fly, but it's not tied. It's not tied with, seal's fur or hare's ear or something. It's got this lovely CDC hackle body, and then these movable fibers, and then the deer hair on top. This gives great visibility, great flotation, and it's got this kind of action from these CDC fibers. So it's an excellent fly. I mean, I would use it if someone would tie them for me. I would use it. But so that's what that was all about. That wasn't what was going on there. It's just that Hans arrives this river. He doesn't know the river from anywhere. He's never been there before in his life. Fishing this big river with fish that I knew them intimately. I've been fishing for these fish all my life. I knew the river. That's what, if I was a guide, I wouldn't be fishing. I would be taught, but I've got so much respect for Hans. One thing I don't like doing unless asked is to give advice to somebody I'm fishing with. If you want advice, I got plenty of it. but I really don't like to just venture forth because, sometimes it doesn't feel all that well for someone to be correcting your fishing. And it can put you right off. Now, I wasn't doing that, but I think Hans could feel it. He wasn't familiar with the water, and he certainly knew how to fish. But when I did so, I knew exactly where the fish were going to be. I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had the fly. It was the right time of day. The fish were on. So when I put a fly out, I knew I had a pretty good chance I was going to get a fish. That's all that was happening that day. It was a zone thing. I was in my zone in every possible way. And Hans was fresh. He was a guest. We did it again in New Zealand, where he was hooking fish all right. But he had some bad luck with breaking them off and missing them and stuff like that went on for a few days. And I know what it was. He was just getting himself rattled about these things. He just started feeling conscious of not connecting. That's not where you want to be when you're fly fishing. You want to be in that other happy place. That's all it was. Yeah. That's what it is. And as you know, a good guide, which I wasn't being, not true. Well, a good guide tries to get his client sort of in a happier place than where he is, because he arrives there nervously with 10,000 flies and every possibility of everything going wrong in his head all the time, and he's being observed by somebody who's standing back, and a good guide is not shouting directions at people. A good guide is somehow saying, look at setting it up beforehand and get, like you said, the fish is happy. You got to get this guy happy too, I think, or this woman, of course, who are some of the extremely good fishermen now. And I know a couple. One, a fishing couple, good friends that fish in New Zealand. They come from Germany, and they really can fish. And boy, they're just dead better than me. I mean, they go into these rivers and they know them. They know what the fish will do, so they guide me. Right? I would never think of guiding them. So, but there's that, and that's who you're fishing with makes a huge difference to who you're with. No, my best friends in my life, the best people actually in my life, are all fly fishermen. Now, I'm not selecting. Well, I am, but I'm not purposely setting out to just meet fly fishermen. It's just that they tend to stick. They've got something in common. You get a certain sense of humor. Like if you fish with guys like Carl McNeil or Peter Morse and these guys, Hans Wellman or Dave Witherow or John Dean, a very good friend in New Zealand, you're just having a whale of a time. And some of them are a bit more competitive than I am, so I don't care. I don't care if they catch the fish. That's the way you should really be going at it. It's just, let's get that fish, then you're really having a good time. Probably one of the best times you can have.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Bob.
Yeah.
Look, we've talked for just coming up an hour and a half, and I think we could go another few hours yet. But I want to say to people about these books, Trout Hunting and What the Trout Want, because they are, as you've probably gathered if you're listening to this, they've been really important books for me. They've been around a little while, not a long time, but a little while now. And if you haven't read them, I can't recommend them enough. As I said, they've shaped me not just how I think about fishing, but they've shaped me as an angler. So for me, it's been such a pleasure to be able to speak with you today, Bob. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. If people want to get hold of these books, how do they get hold of them?
Well, you can't get a hold of Trout Hunting anymore except through something like Abe Books. But I have to say, it's become a little bit of a cult item. I think the prices are getting a little stupid. But What Trout Want is still on for about 16 quid or something on Amazon, so it's still available. They haven't remaindered it yet, so we'll see. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, Amazon is where you get that. But Trout Hunting is hard. I don't know even if I have a copy of Trout Hunting anymore. I'll have to search because you tend to give them to people, and you wind up not having them. And now I look at Abe Books, and I saw there's one on there for about 200 quid or something. I said, wait a minute, I better do a search of my luggage or something. That's ridiculous.
Wow.
So I'm glad you've got a copy, and I've really enjoyed the chat. It's been my pleasure.
Fantastic. And how do people get hold of you, Bob, if they want to? Are you on social media? Are you on Facebook? Are you on these things?
I'm on Facebook. Yep, because I'm, fighting salmon farms. There you'll find me. Just Bob Wyatt. You'll get me. Bob Wyatt. And I don't know what. I don't update my profile ever, but you get me there. Get me on Facebook.
Fantastic.
All you get is salmon farms for me, though. So, fair warning. Okay.
That's good. Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to speak. It's been absolutely fantastic. And yeah, keep up the good fight. And I'm right with you on the salmon farms too.
Attaboy. Keep at 'em. Right, Pete.
Thanks so much, Bob. Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture Podcast. It's been a slightly longer one, but I think you'll agree with me that it's been fascinating listening, and I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to somebody who's one of my heroes too.
The Fly Culture Podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.